This PowerPoint is titled The Integrative Worldview, Healthy Partnerships, Christianity, Psychology, and Human Sexuality. I am Tony S. Frazier, a student here at Liberty University, currently enrolled in Psychology 700, Foundations of Doctoral Study in Psychology. Introduction. The integrative worldview explains how Christian faith and psychological science both offer valuable knowledge about human behavior. Rather than a contradictory viewpoint, the integrative worldview seeks individual understanding by considering biological, social, and spiritual perspectives. In other words, it views it all holistically. This PowerPoint presentation will explore how sexuality, healthy partnerships, and general health are informed by the integrative perspective. What is the integrative worldview? The integrative view recognizes two important knowledge sources. There's biblical truth, knowing that the Word is with God. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word is God. And scientifically researched information. Psychology provides evidence-based information about emotions, behaviors, and cognition, whereas Christianity provides guidance on the purpose of humans, their identity, moral foundation, and spiritual growth. In other words, the Christianity viewpoint provides the guidance that is our roadmap in life, allowing us to gain understanding of our purpose here. What are we intended to do as we embark on our life journey? Together, they provide a broader understanding of human flourishing than either discipline alone. Johnson, 2010. The following scripture reads, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding." This comes from the New International Version, 2011, Proverbs 9 and 10. In other words, those who fear the Lord, that is opening the door of gaining wisdom. However, we have understanding and knowing that He is the Holy One. That is when we have actually ascertained that knowledge. What is the relationship between psychology and Christianity? Johnson 2010 explains that psychology seeks to answer questions about how people think, how we behave, develop, and relate to others, whereas Christianity addresses the purpose of the creation of all beings, the relationship that is with God, and the consequences of sin, even with the possibility of redemption. In other words, understanding that, uh, again, what is our purpose? Why are we here? What is our intentions as we embark on life's journey? When we make mistakes, what does that mean? Do we have the redemption to be forgiven? Can we forgive others? From the perspective of the integrative worldview, the foundations are different but complementary. Scripture provides the foundation for ethical principles and spiritual guidance for daily living. And those things can be the Ten Commandments or even just the verses. Proverbs, for example, providing us with wisdom, understanding as we gauge life. All other perspectives, again, they complement one another, not just individual things, but each sector is important and it comes together holistically. Relationship between psychology and Christianity. Continue. Again, Johnson 2010 stresses that humility It's needed for integration, and we have to be humble in order to be able to accept that all things work together. Scientific and biblical interpretations should be carefully approached because of the limited understanding in humans. In other words, that could be not having faith, lack of faith, not realizing and understand what faith is. Scripture reads, trust in the Lord with all of your heart and lean not on your own understanding. And this comes from the New International Version, 2011, Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Human sexuality through an integrative perspective. Human sexuality is both innate and abundant present. In other words, this is something that we're born with. Also, is something that we can provide to other people, other individuals. Psychology's contribution includes attachment, knowledge regarding emotional intimacy, communication styles, and the development of humans. Christianity teaches that sexuality reflects God's designs for covenant relationships characterized by commitment, love, mutual respect, and faithfulness. This is from Johnson 2010. In other words, from a Christianity viewpoint, the covenant, which is marriage, and being able to enjoy one another through the commitment of love, having the respect of one another, and just being faithful in that covenant. The integrative worldview understands sexuality that is healthy sexuality. We're not talking about, deviances that may be apparent, but healthy mind, body, and soul. It goes beyond surface level attraction. In other words, we're not just looking at the visual, but we're looking at the depth, such as emotional safety, self-regulation, responsibility that is mutual, values and spirituality, and relational commitment. Because the truth belongs to God. God is the truth. Discoveries in science pertaining to attachment styles that are healthy includes healthy communication, being able to be reciprocal and effective with language and communicating, teaching from a biblical perspective, using the Bible or scripture as a gauge as we navigate life, which can complement the covenant and love. This is a foundation for the covenant, which again is marriage, and love, which is unconditional love. That is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. This is the New International Version, 2011, Genesis 2 and 24. And this, again, scripture is in reference to the covenant. Once a man leaves his parents, he becomes one with his significant other, and they become one flesh. My research area is healthy partnership. And this is basically through the development of behaviors that are intentional. Healthy partnerships are established. Both people have to be intentional about what it is that they're wanting to do. Through qualities such as communication, putting in the work, emotional security, effective communication, forgiveness, empathy, commitment, trust is developed. Johnson 2010 argues that psychological research helps explain the processes within a relationship, while scripture encourages humility, unconditional love, grace, servant leadership. My focus in research is gaining an understanding of how the beliefs of Christians and validated approach mutually influence satisfaction in long-term relationships and the overall healthy partnerships. Having that understanding, having that foundation, something that both individuals are agreeing with, and how does that strengthen what they have? Uh, as it relates again to healthy partnerships, my research area, and I've included some Potential research questions. How does faith that is shared influence the quality of the relationship? Something that we can identify. How do we recognize being faithful? How does that strength look, and how does that allow the qualities of the relationship to be reflected? What is the role of forgiveness in relationship resilience? Are we able to forgive? Do we have the capacity to forgive? What does that look like in resilience? Like, are we, overcoming those barriers, when things allow us to forgive the other person for something that went against what we believed in? How does emotionally balanced or emotionally regulated regulation strengthen the covenant? How does that work? And there's a scripture that covers it all. Above all, love each other deeply. This comes from the New International Version, 2011, 1 Peter 4 and 8. In other words, regardless of the adversities that one experiences, scripture reads that we still love each other. The problems should not pull you away from the love that you have. In other words, you still have the love and love them through the problems and love them after the problems. Why the integrative worldview is beneficial? According to Johnson 2010, states that integration builds a more comprehensive understanding of human life because cognitive, relational, emotional, and influences spiritually are simultaneously taken into consideration. Again, those benefits would include having the emotional growth and spirituality growing. Those things are promoted in those relationships. Respecting biblical and scientific truth, having a great respect of understanding what scripture read, what the word says, how that gauges us in life. Healthy partnership support, uplifting, being responsible, being accountable, supporting our person or your person, holistically viewing each individual, not just on the surface, but looking in the core, the depth, looking at the other things, the things that are not tangible. Ethical counseling is encouraged. In other words, what are your moral beliefs, those practices? How do you move through life? What does that have, how does that affect our relationship? And faith is recognized as a source of hope and resilience. Having that faith, knowing that with faith, things are possible through things seen and unseen. That is how we become resilient, overcoming. Again, as we continue, truth is originated with God because God is truth. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Scientific discoveries that accurately describe human behavior need not to conflict with biblical teachings when both are understood properly. This is from Johnson 2010. In other words, biblical principles, we understand what that is. It's a separate entity. And science, that's a separate entity, although sometimes they do merge, and I guess in this perspective integratively they do that. But we have to understand the positions of both entities in order to respect and appreciate the integration. Integrative worldview and practice. Applying the integrative worldview to healthy partnerships and human sexuality. Again, Johnson 2010 explains that an integrative approach considers the entire being, recognizing that the psychological, the biological, the social, and spiritual dimensions influence one another continually. It's not just a one shoe fit all of these dimensions is what create the individual and what makes this work. We have to have healthy uh, biological makeups. We have to maintain our self-care, healthy conversations socially, spiritual dimensions. What are our beliefs? Do we have the faith? And so forth. Partnerships that are healthy develop effectively when these areas are acknowledged rather than independent sources. So understanding that, again, holistically, they all work together in order for the healthy relationship to grow and to survive the resilience, the excuse me, not the resilience, but to be able to grow and to prosper and to be successful amongst the companionship of two individuals. And I included a table. We had an assignment where we talked about this. However, I included the dimensions, the psychological perspectives, the Christian's perspectives, and the application to healthy partnerships. And we're looking at it from the biological dimension. What is the psychological perspective? We're talking about the brain, the hormones, those things that help us to be able to function. The Christian perspective, scripture, talking about the body is created by God and should be honored. Like, this is our temple, we take care of it. An application to healthy partnership is maintaining well-being, going to the doctor, getting ourselves checked up. The psychological components is basically the thought processes, our emotional regulations. Christian perspective would be believers are called to renew their minds and develop their self-control. And this is Romans 12:12. And then as we apply application to that, relationship stability is sustained when emotional stability is present. So when we are emotionally regulated, then our relationships can be sustained because psychologically we have taken care of ourselves. And then we go to the social dimension. When we talk about those psychological perspectives, we're talking about culture and family and trends and patterns. And, the Christian perspective speaks upon Christians are encouraged to live in unity, humility, and love. Ephesians 4:2-3. And then again, the application is just stating that relationships that are healthy thrive, pouring into one another mutually. And then we get to the spirituality, and we talk about those moral values, the beliefs, the purposes. And then our Christian perspective is a relationship where God provides wisdom, purpose, and guidance. And this is from Proverbs 3:5-6. And then again, as it relates to the healthy partnership, having a mutual spiritual belief and values can create a foundation of resilience. And this is the supporting scriptures that I've included. And it's also from the New International Version. And it's saying that through one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves. A cord of three strands is not quickly broken. NIV 2011, Ecclesiastes 4:12. And it's just illustrating that relationships are strengthened when God is included. He is that third strand, and this supports the strength and the resilience. And then we have, and over all these virtues, put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Again, the New International Version, 2011, Colossians 3:14. Again, this is the foundation of love. Love unites spirituality, emotional and relational growth, and healthy companionship. In conclusion, Johnson's 2010 integrated worldview for contemporary psychology remains relevant. In other words, by acknowledging that God is truth, the counselors that are in the Christian sector, psychologists can appreciate scientifically verified information while remaining grounded in biblical principles. This comprehensive framework offers a balanced perspective, because holistically we're taking it all in. For understanding partnerships that are healthy, human sexuality and the overall health and well-being of individuals is needed. And these are my references. The Psychology and Christianity, 5 Views, Johnson E.L., and then the Holy Bible, the New International Version. Thank you. This concludes the presentation.